So as everybody knows, there are protests going on in Cuba. What corporate media is not telling you is that there are also counter-protests going on in Cuba, and they're also pretty large. So I'm not going to get into too much on that front here, because that's not the purpose of this segment. But what I want to show you is the dominant narrative in the West, and the dominant narrative on right-wing TV. So on Fox News, they're hyping up just the protests, not the counter-protests, but the protests, and they're pretending like the U.S. embargo of Cuba has nothing to do with why people are in the streets. Now, we know that's absurd because people are demanding more food and more medical supplies. That would absolutely be improved if the United States lifted our criminal embargo of Cuba. But they're pretending like that's not even a factor at all, and everybody who's out there in the streets wants to overthrow the government in Cuba and implement some sort of U.S.-style system. And of course, they use the buzzwords freedom and democracy, as if, anytime we go toppling governments, that's really what we're concerned about. And as all you guys know, that's definitely not what we're concerned about. We don't have some sort of benevolent, altruistic, principled crusade going on because we just want people to have more freedom and democracy. If that was the case, Saudi Arabia wouldn't be our top ally, Israel wouldn't be our top ally, and we'd have a better track record. And instead of what we do have, which is propping up of dictators, we'd have thriving democracies. Anyway, I digress. Here's the mayor of Miami on Fox News casually floating potential airstrikes of Cuba.
Repressive government and a cruel U.S. embargo. They deserve policies that empower them and help them improve their lives. Do you think that President Biden, looking at this situation, will lift that embargo? And do you think that's what he should do?
No, I don't think the embargo is cruel at all. And I think that the Cuban people are not asking for a lifting of the embargo. They're going out on the streets every single day talking about the failure of the communist regime to provide for its people. And I don't understand why that's so difficult for people to understand. It has failed for 6 decades. And what should be being contemplated right now is a coalition a potential military action in Cuba, similar to what has happened in both administrations, in both Republican and Democrat administrations. In Republican with Bush in Panama, they deposed Noriega, and that country had peaceful democracy for decades. And you had interventions by Democratic presidents, taking out Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It's a sovereign country where they took out a terrorist that probably saved thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and President Clinton in Kosovo, intervening in a humanitarian issue with airstrikes. So there have been many opportunities in the history.
Are you suggesting airstrikes in Cuba?
What I'm suggesting is that option is one that has to be explored and cannot be just simply discarded as an option that is not on the table. And there's a variety of ways the military can do it, but that's something that needs to be discussed and needs to be looked at as a potential option, in addition to a variety of other options that can be discussed.
Absolutely mental. Absolutely mental. Under what authority would we be able to airstrike Cuba? I mean, the idea is, in order for us to strike without congressional approval, you would need a direct, imminent threat of violence, an attack against the U.S. homeland. That is obviously not happening. Nobody's even pretending that's happening, because that would be the most absurd thing anybody said in human history. So if there's not a direct threat of violence against the United States of America, and there's not, under what authority are you going to have Biden and the executive branch and the government or our intelligence agencies just, hey, we're just going to go bomb Cuba? What? I mean, are they actually going to make the argument that it's part of the war on terror or something? Did I miss something? Is Al-Qaeda running the Cuban government? I must have missed that. Is it jihadists over there? Is it the people who attacked us on 9/11? Was it radical Cuban terrorism? What are you talking about? And if you want it to go through the House and the Senate, I got news for you. As insane and corrupt as the House and the Senate are, that shit is not getting through the House or the Senate. Are you out of your mind? But he's just casually floating it. He doesn't talk about under what authority we would do it. And he also doesn't mention, there's this underlying assumption here, like, well, obviously we need to be the savior. We need to be the world police. We're so benevolent and altruistic, and all we care about is freedom and democracy, and that's why we need to go do it. We need to go help these people and liberate these people. What about liberating the people of Saudi Arabia? They're one of our top allies, and they behead people in the street for drug smuggling and apostasy. Are you kidding me? Women have no rights. And you want us to be concerned about what's going on in Cuba as opposed to an area where we actually might be able to have some influence, like with Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm not saying you bomb Saudi Arabia. That's insane. But what I am saying is internal talks, some sort of pressure, some sort of, economic nudging in the right direction. No. But when it comes to Cuba, he's like, I don't understand. Bomb it. What's the problem? This needs to be in the conversation. This needs to be on the table. How psychotic do you have to be to believe that? And then he thinks he's bringing up all these instances of like U.S. successes in regime change or interventions. And number one, he's wrong in that he thinks all the things he cited are, evidence in his favor. It's not. But number two, he didn't mention Libya, failed state with slave markets, objectively worse off now than it was before we bombed. He didn't mention Syria, which is a colossal mess. The U.S. is occupying a third of the country, waging a dirty war, stealing the oil. Jihadist elements control other aspects of the country, and then you have smaller portion of the country, which is effectively the Syrian government and Assad. He doesn't mention Iraq 2.0 with, okay, we got rid of Saddam Hussein, and then it was a colossal mess and hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians died, and we reignited a civil war and sectarian and ethnic flames of conflict. He doesn't mention our history in Latin America. Like, what are you talking? You think our interventions in Latin America during the Cold War were positive? We obliterated many of these countries. We propped up dictators, and there were like death squads, and there was torture. On what planet do you think that this is a good thing? But he casually brings it up as if it's a positive. He compares bombing the Cuban government as if it's like bombing bin Laden. I mean, that was one of the most ridiculous Fox clips I've ever seen, and obviously that says a lot because Fox is wall-to-wall insanity. But he even has the nerve to say at the beginning, no, I don't think the embargo is cruel, and I don't think this has anything to do with the embargo. The original reports, the protests are about, hey man, we need more food and we need more medical supplies. We're kind of light on that, and we can't take it anymore. That is directly linked to the embargo. It's obviously linked to the embargo. Who are you kidding? But he acts like, no, they don't. They actually like the embargo. They just want to overthrow the government. Are you kidding? If you overthrow the government and you still have the embargo in place, they'd be in a similar position. They'd be in a very similar position. Now, I'm not defending every action of the Cuban government. Of course not. I mean, we can have a conversation and go point for point and policy for policy as to what they're doing wrong domestically. More than willing to have that conversation. But to pretend like the embargo has nothing to do with it is the most dishonest thing I've ever heard in my life. Of course it has something to do with it. It absolutely has something to do with it, if not most of it. But this is what we wanted. We wanted to basically starve the Cuban people and then hope that makes them pissed enough to not understand we're at least in part responsible, and so they try to overthrow their own government. That's what we wanted. I mean, this is a classic U.S. action. And it's so disingenuous to pretend, as virtually all elected officials in the U.S. are, except a handful, that like, no, I mean, we care so deeply about the Cubans, but we're in no position to do anything about this except maybe bomb or invade. Jen Psaki said, an invasion of Cuba is not off the table. An invasion of Cuba? So we're talking maybe airstrikes or boots on the ground. Has everybody lost their mind? This is lunacy. If you actually cared about helping the Cuban people, all you have to do is lift the sanctions. That's it. There's over 200 sanctions that Trump put on. To Obama's credit, one of the best things he did was normalize relations with Cuba and lift the embargo. I gave him credit for that at the time. I'm giving him credit for it now, and I'll continue to give him credit for it. In the same way I'll give him credit for the Iran deal. These are some of the best things he did. Biden gets in there, and he keeps the Trump sanctions in place, keeps the embargo there. Why would you do that? Obama was right, Trump is wrong. I thought you were going to bring us back to the Obama years. Why would you do that? I guess on this issue, he happens to agree more with Trump than he does with Obama, but he's wrong. The fact of the matter is, guys, don't take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. You go read the history of it. Look at the history of Cuba. Look at what happened before you had Castro and the revolution. The idea that, like, this right-wing puppet dictator to U.S. interests, Batista, the idea that he was like a lovely person and Cuba was living, free, that's preposterous. Of course that's not the case. There was a revolution because he was a right-wing dictator who was incredibly exploitative, and he allowed the U.S. to exploit Cuba. Basically, like, Cuba was like a peasant state to the U.S. U.S. interests ran it. So what happened is there was a revolution, and you had the oil industry in 1960 was nationalized by the Cubans. And so before it was, U.S. corporations were benefiting from Cuban oil. And then the Cuban people took it over and nationalized it. So that's the thing that the U.S. viewed as unforgivable. Not too dissimilar, remember this, in the 1950s, in Iran, they elected a left-wing leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, democratically elected leader. He wanted to nationalize the oil, and it was the U.S. and the U.K. that basically were exploiting and stealing the oil, and they said, not going to let that happen. And so the CIA overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, and we put the Shah into power to be a dictator in Iran. And then eventually in the 1970s, late 1970s, we had the Islamic Revolution, and they overthrew the Shah. So, I mean, the history of this stuff is crystal clear. Like, you can go read it. Don't take my word for it. And you'll see exactly what was going on here. You'll see what our real concerns are. Our concerns are U.S. corporate interests. Our concerns are stealing natural resources. Our concerns are trying to gain a subservient puppet state. That's our concern. Our concern is the oil. That's our concern. This idea that we care about freedom or democracy or we got to liberate the people. If you believe that, you're 9 years old. And clearly on right-wing TV, and politicians of both parties are 9 years old because they can't see through this and they're making a lot of these dumb arguments. It really drives me crazy. I mean, we need to have a media that's honest about this stuff, and they're not. And the fact that I'm a loudmouth YouTuber like myself is one of the few places where you can go where we even talk about the fucking embargo. It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling, but that's where we are.